Welcome back to an introduction to writing philosophy. This lesson will focus on crafting a working thesis statement. So by the end of this lecture, you should know what a thesis statement is, understand its purpose, and be able to craft a working version of your thesis statement that you plan to defend in this paper. Remember that in our very first lesson, I talked about how every philosophy paper will have a thesis. Your thesis is the position that you take on an issue, an answer you give to a particular question, or a solution that you propose to some problem. The thesis statement, on the other hand, is where you briefly articulate that position and the reason you hold it. It's a short summary of the position you plan to defend in your paper and why you are defending this position. You don't need to have a fully fleshed out thesis statement to begin working on your paper. In fact, your thesis statement will probably change and get more refined by the time you're done. However, you do need to have something to get the ball rolling. And this is where a working thesis statement comes into play. A working thesis statement is basically a starting point for focusing your paper. It should include a clear and concise summary of the position you plan to defend, and at least one reason why you hold this position. Having a working thesis will help you in a variety of ways. It will keep you focused while you're researching your topic. It will help you to develop a relevant argument for your position. And it will also make it easier for others to assist you and give you feedback while you're working on your paper. So this is the reason why we need a working thesis statement early on in the writing process. First of all, it's hard to know what you need to research if you don't know what you're looking for. It's also hard to develop an argument if you don't know what you're defending. And it's also very difficult for people to give you feedback or suggestions if you can't explain exactly what it is you're trying to do with your paper. So these are all the ways that having a working thesis statement will help you. To do its job well, a working thesis statement should be clear. It should be concise, and it should be controversial. It should be clear what your position is and why you hold it. It should be something that you can explain in a short sentence or two. And declaring your position on this topic should invite others to disagree with you, or at the very least, to ask you more questions, to ask you for an argument in defense of your view. Remember, your thesis statement is not your argument, but it should prompt someone else to ask you for an argument. It should prompt someone to say, okay, I understand what you're saying. Tell me why you hold this view and why you think I should adopt your position. Again, this will be refined and clarified and maybe even altered somewhat considerably by the time you actually submit the final version of your essay for this course. That is perfectly normal. This is something that is to be almost expected. But it's really important that we get started and we get as narrow and as clear as we possibly can early on in the process. Here's a couple of examples of some not so good thesis statements and what's the problem with them. So here's one example. In this paper, I intend to talk about abortion. This is not a thesis statement. This is telling us what your topic is, but it tells us nothing about your position on this issue. Here's another example. In this paper, I will argue that God does not exist. Okay, we're getting a little bit closer, but we still don't know why you are arguing for this position. You got to give us at least something. Give us at least one reason why you're defending this view. Here's a couple of examples of how we can make these thesis statements better. In this paper, I intend to argue that abortion is immoral on the grounds that the fetus enjoys a right to life. This tells us what position you're arguing for, tells us why you hold the position. The relevance to philosophy is clear. This is clearly a philosophical debate. We're talking about right to life and what counts as something that enjoys such a right. It also raises questions and invites disagreements. Some questions it raises would be, for one thing, why should we think that a fetus enjoys a right to life? What actually is the right to life? What does that consist of? And of course, it invites disagreements because this is an incredibly controversial issue. Another example of a better thesis statement. In this paper, I intend to argue that God cannot exist because the concept of God is illogical. The position is clear, its relevance to philosophy is clear. We're talking about modal possibility, we're talking about logic and conceptual clarity, all great topics for a philosophy paper. It raises questions. For example, why should we think that the concept of God is illogical? Maybe even a further question would be, why does that mean that God cannot exist? Because of course, maybe the concept is illogical, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the thing it refers to isn't real. This gets into some really interesting territories. And of course, it invites disagreements. I just wanted to give a couple of examples for the purposes of this lecture. Some additional guidelines: the kind of thesis statement that you create may depend on the type of paper that you're writing. For example, if you're writing a paper where you're defending a position, which is the format that I followed for the two examples I gave before, then it's pretty straightforward. You can follow a template like this. In this paper, I intend to argue that blank because blank, or I intend to show that on the grounds that, and so on. But there are other kinds of papers that we can write. We can also write papers where we are criticizing someone else's argument, where we are trying to show why the premises of another philosopher's argument are unsound. In other words, why we should think these premises are false, which would lead us to doubt their conclusion. You can choose another philosopher's argument and show why we shouldn't accept it. Now, of course, this would presume that you are aware of some other philosopher's work on a particular topic and you have access to it, and you would be able to explain it in your paper. In that case, too, you would probably spend most of your context and background section fleshing out your opponent's view and then moving on to your own counter-argument. But I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, and like I said, I wouldn't recommend taking that strategy unless you feel you have had some experience in the past with writing that kind of work. And we'll talk a little bit about both of these types of papers more in our lecture on argument and exposition.